The Butterfly Defect, a lepidopteran lark through time, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Chrysalis, by Sven Clarkson. In the vast, swirling chaos of the universe, where galaxies perform an eternal waltz and black holes play cosmic hide and seek, there exists a peculiar planet called Earth, and on this improbable blue marble there lived one doctor. Sophie Carter, a woman whose obsession with butterflies would make even the most dedicated lepidopterist raise an eyebrow and mutter. A bit much, isn't it? Sophie's fascination with these aerodynamically challenged insects began, as most life-altering fixations do, in a garden that existed in a perpetual state of quantum uncertainty. It was her nanny's garden in Bradford, a place where the laws of biology came to holiday and often forgot to leave. Here flowers would bloom in colors that hadn't been invented yet, and bees would perform complex mathematical equations through the medium of interpretive dance. But it was the butterflies that captured young Sophie's attention. These creatures, with their blatant disregard for the principles of efficient flight and their penchant for tasting with their feet, a habit that would be considered quite rude in most social circles, seemed to Sophie to be nature's way of saying, "Watch this, I'm going to do something silly." Fast forward through years of studying, countless nights spent poring over books with titles like The Quantum Mechanics of Butterfly Wing Patterns and So You Think You Can Lepidoptera. And Sophie found herself with a PhD and a burning desire to save the endangered Papilio chaos butterfly. Most people would have been content with starting a conservation program or perhaps writing a strongly worded letter to their local MP. But Sophie Carter was not most people. No, Sophie decided that the only logical course of action was to borrow a time machine from a colleague who had built it accidentally while trying to create the world's most efficient toaster. The time machine came with instructions scrawled on a napkin in handwriting that looked like it had been written by a seismograph during an earthquake. The napkin itself seemed to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, which made reading it a task akin to trying to lick your own elbow while standing on your head. Armed with this dubious technology and a determination that would make a lemming look cautious, Sophie set out to save the butterflies. Her plan was simple: travel back to the Cretaceous period, make a few minor adjustments to the proto-butterfly population, and boom, Papilio chaos saved. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, everything. Absolutely everything. Sophie's first foray into temporal meddling resulted in a world without tea. No Earl Grey, no English breakfast, not even a sad bag of dusty Darjeeling lurking at the back of the cupboard. The butterfly effect of her actions had somehow eradicated the very concept of tea from human history. As Sophie wandered through this tea-less dystopia, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. It wasn't just the absence of her favorite beverage, it was the realization that she had fundamentally altered the course of human history. The American Revolution never happened, no tea to throw into the harbor, you see, and the British Empire continued its colonial rule, fueled by an inexplicable addiction to lukewarm tap water. She watched as people went about their days, a certain spark missing from their eyes. Afternoon socials were dull affairs, with people awkwardly holding empty cups and making small talk about the weather. The very fabric of British society seemed to be unraveling, thread by tea-less thread. It was in this moment that Sophie first grasped the true weight of her actions. She had set out to save a species, but in doing so, had she lost something integral to her own? With a heavy heart and a parched throat, she knew she had to make things right. Horrified by this tea-less dystopia, Sophie leapt back into her time machine faster than you could say "not my cup of." Oh, right. Her second attempt resulted in a world obsessed with balloons. People floated to work on giant helium-filled orbs, communicated through an elaborate system of balloon animals, and considered the popping of a balloon to be a capital offense. Sophie spent days in this inflated reality, marveling at the ingenuity and absurdity of it all. She watched as businessmen conducted meetings while bobbing gently on the ceiling, tethered to their chairs by thin strings. Children in parks played elaborate games of balloon tag, their laughter mixed with the squeaky sounds of rubbing latex. The butterfly effect had become the balloon effect, and Sophie was starting to feel a bit lightheaded. Undeterred, though perhaps she should have been, Sophie made a third attempt. This time she returned to a world where fashion had taken a decidedly prehistoric turn. Everyone wore uncomfortable plant-based clothing, itching and scratching their way through life in outfits that made burlap sacks look like haute couture. Sophie found herself sporting a rather fetching oak leaf blazer and poison ivy trousers, wondering if perhaps she should have paid more attention in her botany classes. By her fourth attempt, Sophie was beginning to think that perhaps meddling with time wasn't the brilliant idea she'd initially thought it was. But surely one more try couldn't hurt. Oh, how wrong she was. This time she returned to a world trapped in eternal summer. Christmas was celebrated on the beach, snowmen were built from sand, and the very concept of winter had become a myth told to scare small children. It was at this point that Sophie, sweating profusely in her leaf couture and watching people exchange gift-wrapped sunscreen, decided that perhaps it was time to stop meddling. With a heavy heart and significantly lighter clothing, she returned to the prehistoric era one last time. As she sat in the ancient forest, observing proto-butterflies flitting about, Sophie felt a profound sense of humility wash over her. Who was she to decide the fate of an entire species? The weight of her previous attempts pressed down on her, each disaster a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of her actions. Perhaps she mused, swatting at a mosquito the size of a small bird. Nature knows what it's doing after all. Who am I to play God, or rather, super lepidopterist? With this new perspective, Sophie returned to her own time, hoping against hope that she hadn't caused any more temporal catastrophes. Upon her final return to the present, Sophie found a world that seemed almost normal. Tea existed, thank goodness, and fashion was no longer a form of vegetative torture, and the seasons had returned to their regular schedule. But as she breathed a sigh of relief, she noticed something odd. People were going about their daily lives as usual, but with one small difference. Everyone had butterfly wings and antennae. Yes, in her attempts to save the butterflies, Sophie had somehow turned the entire human race into butterfly hybrids. Men in business suits fluttered their wings as they hailed taxis. Children played tag using their antennae to sense each other's whereabouts, and little old ladies used their newfound ability to fly to rescue cats from trees. As Sophie stood there, mouth agape, watching this lepidopteran version of humanity go about its day, she couldn't help but think that perhaps this wasn't so bad after all. Sure, it wasn't what she had intended, but at least the papilio chaos was no longer endangered. In fact, one could argue it was now the dominant species on the planet. And so, sipping her hard-earned cup of Earl Grey carefully, so as not to spill it on her new wings, Sophie reflected on her journey. She had set out to save a species and had ended up transforming humanity. It wasn't the outcome she had expected, but then again, in a universe where butterflies exist, anything is possible. As she sat there, wings gently fluttering, she couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. And Sophie realized that in her quest to save one species, she had inadvertently created a world where humans might be better equipped to understand and protect the natural world. After all, it's hard to ignore environmental issues when you're part of the ecosystem in such a literal way. As for the time machine? Well, let's just say it's been safely decommissioned and repurposed into a rather quirky tea cozy. After all, some things are best left untampered with, especially when they come with instructions on a napkin. And so, Dr. Sophie Carter, accidental transformer of humanity, settled into her new life. She still had her research, her tea, and now a pair of magnificent wings. Life, she decided, was pretty good. And if anyone asked about the sudden appearance of wings on the human population, well, that was just nature's way of saying, watch this, I'm going to do something silly.